Hey everyone, welcome to the Do What You Can Live With podcast. I'm Brandi Mac and happy to be here as usual. Thank you to those who continue to tune in each time I make one of these, which seems to be a little more consistent. If you like what you're hearing, please like, follow, leave a review because it matters more than you know. So on today's episode, we're going to be talking about how the drug supply is changing. I want you to imagine something. It's 2 a.m. You're in the kitchen, your phone's on the counter, and you haven't heard from your loved one who's in active addiction in a week. And the last time you saw them, they were so high you barely even recognized them. You've been told to let go, that they have to hit rock bottom, that you simply cannot want it more than they do. But now I'm going to tell you something that's going to make that advice a little more scarier, is that the drug supply is changing. It's kind of been changing. You see, fentanyl is getting a lot harder to find in many areas. And I know you're probably thinking, oh, that's a good thing. Not necessarily. And when you look at the big picture of things, fentanyl overdoses are down, I think, for the second year in a row, which is amazing. And I constantly give harm reduction that credit because they did get, Narcan out in the community, and they really had that funding and support to provide education to so many families. And then EMS with the Narcan that they've been carrying, and just the big shift that we kind of had. But this is the issue with fentanyl going down. You see, when the government steps in and they try to cut off access to a supply such as fentanyl, unfortunately, history has shown this repeatedly, is a newer, oftentimes more deadlier drug will simply replace it. And that's terrifying. I think I talked about this several episodes back briefly, but one of the drugs I want to talk about that continues to kind of infiltrate and take over the drug supply is medetomidine, which is an animal tranquilizer. And then we're going to talk about the methamphetamine comeback. Now, those who have a loved one that is primarily addicted to methamphetamines, trust me, I know you're thinking, this is not a comeback. It is here. And I feel you, because in my hometown, we have a huge meth issue. And I feel like we always have. And a lot of times, though, like my daughter's drug of choice, it was fentanyl. But did she shoot up meth? Yeah, she did. A lot of times they do. They use what they can get their hands on. And that's kind of the bigger picture here in this episode, is that when their drug of choice is not available, it doesn't mean they're just going to quit. They're going to turn to something else, and it may be meth. It may be what they think is fentanyl, but ultimately it's cut with medetomidine and God knows what else. We're going to talk some about Nitazines, which are synthetic opioids that make fentanyl look like an ibuprofen, because we need to have a serious conversation that as long as there is demand, there will be a supply. And it's not as simple as blowing up boats, throwing people in prison. And so this conversation might be a little uncomfortable. It may challenge you to hear kind of a different perspective, and that's okay, because a lot of the things I'm going to talk about, I did not buy into just a few years ago. But the more I kind of educated myself, had full-blown conversations with people who are in recovery, and having real discussions about this, it gave me a completely different perspective. And I really respect this community and those who are doing outreach, feet on the ground, who take the time to really talk to me and have these discussions without getting frustrated. And they usually won't get frustrated as long as you're open to learning and hearing a different perspective. It doesn't mean you have to agree with it. So I ask that, you kind of just sit through this. I'm not asking you to agree with me, and I am always open. Please email me, message me, and give me a counter to this, an argument, and I'll make another episode and I'll read what you said and to kind of tell you my thought process through it. So let us start with the headline everyone wants to celebrate, and I do agree with celebrating it, but we have to remember that we're still losing thousands and thousands of lives every year. Overdoses in the U.S., they have dropped. We were actually under, I think, 100,000 for the first time since 2020, as of 2024, which is awesome. So as of 2023, like 76% of pills that the DEA tested with lethal doses of fentanyl, 76% were found to have lethal doses of fentanyl. That has since dropped to under 30%. And I'll read to you kind of one excerpt from a study. A study published in the Journal of Science in January 2026 found that a major supply shock likely tied to Chinese government crackdown on precursor chemicals was the primary driver of the decline of the purity when it came to fentanyl and overall, I guess, fentanyl production. So basically, it was disruption to the raw ingredients. And that's awesome news, right? We can't dispute that. I mean, I would love it if addiction didn't even exist, because it wreaks havoc on so many lives and families. But what seems like fantastic news, this is where, I need you to just kind of breathe and kind of hear me out on the rest of this. Because the biggest issue is that the illicit market, it will adapt. Going back to what I said earlier, as long as there is demand, there will be a supply of something. I mean, history has shown this. Anytime the government pushes back and there's a squeeze on one drug, a new drug comes out and takes over the market. When you cut off heroin, pills flooded the market. When they cut off OxyContin, fentanyl flooded the market. We've kind of progressively been heading towards a deadlier substance each time. So now that we've disrupted the fentanyl chain, unfortunately, something worse is already here. Raise your hand if you've heard of medetomidine. I have. It's not across the U.S. completely yet. I know that, the Maryland area, Philly, all of those areas, big cities, they're kind of being hit with this drug. And the issue is it's spreading fast. So you may have heard of xylazine, right? That was kind of the drug we were hearing about, God, for the last few years. Especially I was hearing about it in like the Philly area. And xylazine is an animal tranquilizer and it causes horrible wounds. But the problem is medetomidine is taking over kind of xylazine's place, and it's 100 to 200 times more potent. And it's also an animal tranquilizer, and it does not respond to Narcan. So here's some more data that kind of came out of Maryland testing, because these cities that are being hit, they're actively testing the supply on a regular basis to kind of know what's hitting the market. And I think that's important, because that kind of helps if something's going to really take over the entire drug supply of our country. It kind of gives people who specialize in addiction medicine and research, they're going to have that information so that they can hopefully prepare a plan when it does take over. So data from Philadelphia's drug checking program looks like in May of 2024, medetomidine was found in 29% of fentanyl samples. By November of 2024, it was found in 87%. So Narcan does not reverse medetomidine. Now, that does not mean you stop giving Narcan. You always give Narcan, because you do want to reverse any fentanyl that could be in the system. You see, medetomidine isn't an opioid, as I said before. It's an animal tranquilizer. It's not even meant for humans. And one of the really scary things is that it can cause severe bradycardia. So you want to give Narcan because any fentanyl that's lingering in the body, that's going to hopefully kick in and they're going to start breathing, but they're going to stay completely sedated. And the bradycardia that goes with this, it is very dangerous. Something I kind of didn't know about this when I started to explore it is with medetomidine, the withdrawal is pretty significant, and that they can become very hypertensive. So their blood pressure can spike really high, which can lead to strokes. They'll have altered mental status, tremors. And so not only do you have a patient in this situation that is going to be withdrawing likely from opioids, because like I said, fentanyl is still very much in that supply. They're also going to be coming off of medetomidine with all these other symptoms. And that's pretty terrifying in itself. And so if you're on the East Coast and near one of these bigger cities, more than likely your loved one, they're getting medetomidine, just so parents, loved ones are aware. And essentially, this is what an unregulated drug supply looks like. Nobody knows what they're getting. Something else I think is important to talk about is when fentanyl gets harder to find, well, people don't just quit. They don't just get sober, because addiction is way more complex than that. So when the drug you're dependent on is no longer available, out of desperation and withdrawal and just wanting to feel better and not feel sick, you're going to look for anything to replace that. And right now, one of the easiest drugs to find is methamphetamines. And in fact, in many states, that's like the number one threat, more than fentanyl. Do you remember? Gosh, I remember I was married to my ex-husband. I was living in Tennessee and we had bought a house and it was in a nice neighborhood. And I was wondering why the house next door to us just would not sell, because it was a really nice house. But apparently the people who had been living there had been cooking meth. And I didn't realize it, but I guess like anytime they're using these chemicals and cooking in there, it like seeps into the walls and the drywall and the insulation, and it's actually very toxic for people. So that was why that house was not selling. And I remember Faces of Meth. Do you remember the billboards they used to have? I remember seeing those caught in Tennessee. But methamphetamines, you didn't need Mexico to bring shit. You could make it in a Coke bottle. People had a freaking meth lab in the trunk of their car. You know, one of the scary things when it comes to methamphetamines is the fact that we don't have a very good solid treatment for it. You know, at least with fentanyl, you know, we have Suboxone, we have methadone, and you know, the monthly injection like Brixadi and Sublocade. But when it comes to methamphetamines, they do have a combination that they're doing, which I can get more into for it now that seems promising. I think it's Wellbutrin. I'm thinking naltrexone and Wellbutrin is the combo they're doing. I'm going to need to look that up. I mean, meth is horrible. And if you've ever seen your loved one in a psychosis, it's terrifying. I have. And so has my mom, and it's horrible. And then even patients that I've just cared for over the years. Ultimately, many times, I can't tell you how many that came in and like a methamphetamine psychosis, when they get brought into the ER, they ultimately have to be heavily sedated and intubated to allow those drugs to leave the system, because there's no reasoning. They can easily be violent. They're completely out of their minds, which is why it's a psychosis. But it's very, very scary. Now, the meth I talked about back in the day that was being made in Coke bottles, that was, you know, being made in the trunk of the car, that's currently not the supply that we're getting now. Actually, a lot of what we're getting is from Mexico, and it is pure, very pure, which is way stronger than what you were getting from cooking it up at home, also known as the shake and bake method. And if you're as old as I am and remember, you would hear about these horrible burns and explosions from people doing this shake and bake method, or like a house fire or explosion from some of these meth labs. And so with methamphetamines coming from Mexico, you don't hear of that as often. But I mean, if we continue to cut off the supply, say from Mexico and other countries like we have with fentanyl, and you see those go down, like I said, if people want to get high, they will find a way and they'll go back to those methods. And the thing is that people who use methamphetamines, the drug supply has been so tainted with fentanyl that you weren't even just getting meth. So a lot of times they were getting fentanyl cut into it. Just from discussions I've had with my daughter, she even said she liked to use both when she could because it balanced it out. Whether your drug of choice is fentanyl, it's not going to be that hard to go and turn solely to methamphetamines if it's going to help you kind of forget that fentanyl withdrawal you're going through. And it's just this unfortunate, endless cycle. And this is why addiction is so complex, because it isn't just cutting off the drug that they take and enjoy. I mean, this is the thing in regards to OxyContin. So many people, they were told that drug was non-addictive and they were prescribed in it and it was very addictive. And then, when word kind of got out, they're hooked on these. Yes, there was a lot of abuse that was taking place because it was so addictive, but people who had never even struggled with addiction, they were cut off from it, dealing with horrible withdrawal, and they ended up turning to street drugs. They turned to fentanyl. They turned to anything they could to make them feel better. To be completely honest, and this is the government as a whole, okay? This is not picking political sides because this is an endless cycle that has happened with Democrats and Republicans who have been in office. I mean, we're talking decades of this. But our government has allowed for manipulation by big pharma, by big alcohol, like I talked about in the last episode. Essentially make it possible to where information is withheld or it's just a straight up fucking lie. Like OxyContin, them getting the FDA to say, it was non-addictive. Probably one of the most addictive pain pills that has existed. And Big Pharma knew that. The Sackler family knew that. And I really feel like even with the settlement money, the accountability is severely lacking. Like things like this should not even be happening. But you know what happens? They essentially pay off these people. The person they got to agree to say it was non-addictive eventually left their position at the FDA and went to work for that pharmaceutical company. And, and that's what happens. And there should be accountability all the way across the board. Like serious accountability. Like, how are these places even still in business? How are they allowed to produce any type of drug? Because it's criminal, in my opinion, what they get away with. And like I talked about in the last podcast episode, when it comes to alcohol, 50% of revenue that big alcohol makes is from 10% of its buyers, the most addicted. And they know that. And alcohol kills, double what all other drugs combined yearly. That averages 108,000 a year. And they lobby, they have all this money, and it's just really disgusting. And me working in healthcare, the more I learn about this, the more and more disgusted I am. And just the fact that our government allows it. And this is just multiple administrations, I'm not talking about the current one even. Another important drug we need to talk about, which is even worse than medetomidine, is nitazines. And it's a synthetic opioid just like fentanyl, but way deadlier. In fact, just some fun fact information I'm going to read to you. Nitazine was developed by a Swiss pharmaceutical lab in the 1950s, but ultimately abandoned because they were too dangerous for human use. They ultimately shelved them for like 60 years, but now they're showing up in street drug supplies. I'm probably going to completely butcher this name, but one that apparently keeps showing up and like supply is isotoniazine, sometimes called ISO. Apparently it is 5 to 9 times stronger than fentanyl. Wow. And some variants of nitazine are 500 times more potent than morphine. And of course, it's cheap to make, and it's showing up in counterfeit pills. Now, the one good thing about nitazines is because it is a synthetic opioid like fentanyl, is that Narcan will in fact work on it. It may take multiple doses though, because it is so potent, but that is, a positive. But that's something we need to prepare mentally for, because nitazine is way deadlier than fentanyl. And now I figured we'd talk a little about prohibition. So we're going to go back like 100 years. Just bear with me, please. If you stuck around this long, I just want to say thank you. So prohibition, the easiest thing to talk about is alcohol. In the 1920s, the U.S. had banned the manufacturing and sale of alcohol. And ultimately, consumption did drop, but you know what else happened? The black market exploded. Like moonshine, when you hear about moonshine? And ultimately, the alcohol being produced was way more potent, way deadlier. What's fascinating about this and terrifying at the same time is the bootleggers were stealing like industrial grade alcohol in order to produce something that they could ultimately sell. And you want to know what the U.S. response was to it? Make it more poisonous. And by making it more poisonous, ultimately, it was known to cause blindness and even death. And death is exactly what happened. And it was estimated that before it was legalized again, that roughly like 10,000 people died from the poisoning, not from the alcohol itself, but from the poisoning because it was being sold on the black market. So more lives were lost. And it kind of sounds familiar, right? A lot of times we tend to not want to view alcohol the same way, but it is. Because essentially what we're seeing in the drug supply, it's the same exact pattern. Essentially, you had a pretty pure form of fentanyl, and as more crackdown happens, the black market, eventually you just never know what they're going to get. And that's really scary, because anytime you seem to have a supply disruption, something else is getting mixed in, and that isn't going to stop. And that's what I need loved ones to understand. We're not just going to get rid of drugs. You kind of have to stop blaming the substance and start asking, what solution is that substance bringing them? Because oftentimes it can be very much trauma related and pain related. So many factors can play a part in it. Yeah, of course, there's people who like to get high and have fun and party. But for a lot of these people, you should always be wondering, these people who are truly addicted, habitual relapsers, is what solution is that drug bringing them? And that's something I need you to sit with and recognize, because when you can truly view it from that perspective, it kind of takes some of that anger away. Now, the things they do in active addiction to the family, what they put you through, that's hard and brutal enough. But oftentimes we want to look for something to blame, and we want to blame the drug. We want to blame the person. But I think you also have to ask yourself, what solution are they getting from that? Because it can be pretty deep and they may not even realize it. There is an interesting quote from a New York City medical examiner during Prohibition. Dr. Charles Norris said something that hits differently today. He called the government's poisoning program our noble experiment in extermination. And though we're not poisoning the drug supply on purpose, like I'm not saying that's what the government is doing, but we are still watching the consequences of prohibition. Because I think, if you've been impacted by this, if they're going to use drugs, they're going to use drugs. There's nothing that you can do about that. They're going to have to want to quit. So now we can go into where I'm going with this, okay? This is going to be a tough one. We're going to talk about legal supply. I know. Hear me out, okay? Just hear me out. So a lot of experts, not like me. I'm not an expert in this. Yes, I'm a nurse practitioner, but more than anything with these discussions is I'm a mom. I'm a mom with lived experience of having a daughter in recovery and going through that hell of multiple relapses with fentanyl. But a number of public health experts have kind of advocated and argued that the only way to truly stop the poisoning and all the deaths is to have a safe supply. I know, it probably sounds horrifying to you. And there's actually many, not in our country, but other countries where they are actually doing this very thing. I was reading in Canada, I guess they have physicians for people who are like high risk of overdose. They have physicians who will actually prescribe high doses of opioids, which, even for me, when I kept hearing a lot of the harm reduction community, them talking about how much safe supply is needed, I was like, you're out of your freaking mind. How is that going to help? But when you look at the risk with like the black market and what's in drugs, they're not trying to die. Or they think, maybe they're taking an Adderall pill and it's cut with fentanyl and they lose their life, or a Xanax and the same thing, they lose their life. If people are really wanting to party, have fun, do something, I don't like to say young and dumb, but there's just a lot of people who don't necessarily, they're not thinking about it. They're wanting relief, or they're wanting to study really hard, because I know it's not uncommon for people to use Adderall in college, and they buy on the black market and it looks legit. They take it and they lose their life. That shouldn't be happening. So essentially, safe supply is just that. It's giving them a specific quantity of a substance so they don't have to play Russian roulette. And I can't help but agree with that. Apparently in Switzerland, they actually have like a heroin assisted treatment since the 90s. I mean, that's a long time. And I guess the outcome I'm not going to say it's all positives, but essentially the people in Switzerland, the citizens, have continued to vote for it to stay in place, because I guess there's been a decrease in infection and in overdoses, burden on the criminal justice system. And because of that, multiple times they continue to vote for that to stay in place. Now, some of my views on this is when you look at like buprenorphine, which is Suboxone, more or less, Subutex, all those, and then methadone. In some ways, I consider that a safe supply, right? It provides oftentimes improved quality of life. They get a job. They get their families back. It takes away the cravings. Their body is dependent on those medications. But for those who really struggle to get off of these really strong opioids, such as fentanyl, there's a lot of benefit to that. The problem is, we have we have abstinent-based program that continues to, I feel like, contribute to the stigma surrounding these medications. And so many are scared to utilize it, and they're great tools. My daughter, for those who maybe don't know, my daughter was a habitual relapser, and she was an IV fentanyl user. She went to treatment 9 times in 4 years, and she would relapse within 30 days of discharge every single time. And she tried abstinence. I was very anti-medicated assisted treatment, and ultimately, because I was open to education, she was willing to try it. And honestly, it's been a godsend. She has over 2 years in recovery. Yes, she has to have a want. It's a tool because you can still use other substances on it. But I got my daughter back. My grandson got his mom back, and my daughter is just flourishing. And I don't know if it would have been possible without that tool. She was on Subutex for over a year, and she's been on Sublocade now, gosh, I think about a year. And, this is going to be a new journey for us. She falls off my insurance next month, actually. It's pretty scary for me because Medicaid here in Florida, it does not cover Sublocade. But she's open. She's been on it so long, and Sublocade can stay in your system for up to a year many times. And it allows your body to kind of slowly wean itself off without the withdrawal. And so that's the plan. I haven't even talked openly about this on social media at all, but the plan is for her to get her last injection this month and no more. It's scary for me as a mom. It's scary for her. I've talked to her a lot about it. And I just told her, I said, more than anything, your mind is a dirty little bitch. And sometimes it's mindset and thinking you need something. And this is just a monthly injection. So she at least got out of the ritual of like taking something every day to feel better, which is why I think the shot is so great. But I told her, I said, worst case, you go back on Subutex. And, and her psychiatrist fully supports that and has said that she would do that if needed. So that'll be a whole new journey. It's scary, but she's grown so much. And more than anything, I'm trying to convey to her that it doesn't make her a failure if she needed to restart it. But more than anything, the most important piece is she has to communicate with me so that I know. She can't internalize this. She can't be scared of freaking me out. I'm not the same person as I was before. And I need her to kind of come to me and tell me sooner rather than later if she's having really bad cravings and thoughts of use, because I've said this before and I'll say it again. If my daughter needed to be on medicated assisted treatment for the rest of her life, I would fully support that. That is how much I believe in it, just because I'm a witness to it in my own family. And I was really very anti in the very beginning of this journey. So I encourage you to be open-minded as a loved one and a clinician if you're listening, and maybe you have stigmatized views about it, but I have seen it. And as scary as it is, I support whatever path she chooses to go on. So, I will share more of that kind of as we go along, but it's definitely terrifying, just seeing it, because I got my daughter back because of her desire and because of these meds. And that matters, and so we'll see. But as far as kind of circling back around to like safe supply, Kind of like I mentioned earlier, initially my instincts were like, hell no, that is a horrible idea. But the amount of overdoses that I have cared for myself and just the amount of horrible, sad, heartbreaking stories that I hear from parents who lost their child to an overdose, they're endless. Nobody's using those drugs to die. And that's why, from that standpoint, like I said, if they're going to use, they're going to use. I'd rather them use a safe supply than getting God knows what on the black market. I wish we didn't even have to be having this discussion, in all honesty. But just from a health standpoint and what history has shown us, it's just going to be this endless cycle. It's not just going to stop. Addiction isn't just going to go away. So if you're listening to this and your loved one is currently using, here's what I need you to know right now. First thing is the drug supply is more unpredictable than it's ever been. What your loved one bought last week very well might not be what they buy this week. So they may not even know what they're taking. Even their dealer may not even know what they're taking. 2, Narcan still matters. Even if you hear about the drug supply being taken over by medetomidine or xylazine or God knows what else, always give Narcan. And it may mean that a few doses need to be given. The important thing is that they start breathing. Because remember, the tranquilizer in the drug supply, Narcan isn't going to reverse that, but it will reverse the fentanyl or any other opioid, Nitazines. It can reverse that. But they just might not wake up right away. And 3, rock bottom has no place today that it may have had 10, 20 years ago. The drug supply continues to get more potent, and rock bottom easily means death. I can't say that enough. What they go through, the loved ones that are living out on the streets, what they go through, oftentimes horrible, horrible stories I've heard from my own daughter. Melissa, who I interviewed last month, has shared about her own daughter. If that isn't rock bottom, the only other thing worse than that seems like death. And so stop listening to the rhetoric of they have to want it. Stop enabling. What is it? Oh my God. If you baby the addict, you'll bury the addict. I just think that's a load of bullshit, in all honesty. I mean, ultimately, at the end of the day, it comes down to what I say, what my book is about. Do what you can live with, okay? If it allows you to sleep a little easier at night, there is nothing you or I can do to make them get sober. But what we can do is we can love them, we can show up for them in ways that fit within our own individualized boundaries. At the end of the day, that is what matters. And that's why I just think that a lot of this old ideology, it just has no place today. And that's not against 12-step programs, because I know a lot of 12-step programs have helped many. It helped my mom. But they have no right attacking other paths of recovery. And that is what they do. Not all. There are very wonderful people that I have had the pleasure to engage with in conversations via comment sections or private messaging, who are sponsors themselves. And they do not like a lot of this old timer mentality that still continues to get pushed. And it's okay if what you're using worked for you, but it doesn't mean it's going to work for everyone. And so that's the thing, because at the end of the day, as a loved one, you have to live with every decision you make. And I, being in the position I'm in, I hear the unfortunate stories of the regret. This is hard enough. The last thing we need is more shame. And 4, Your instinct to stay connected with your loved one, it's not enabling. It's survival. It's love. Connection saves lives because shame and isolation thrive in addiction. But you want to be the kind of connection that keeps the door open so that when they finally are ready for recovery, they're going to come to you. They're going to reach out because it's not enabling to hold their hand and help them even find a treatment program. Some people will go as far as saying that is. They're wanting help. If they're coming to you wanting help, to still shame families for simply helping them do that, I have to question that person's mental state, in all honesty. Okay, so I started this episode by asking you to imagine yourself standing in the kitchen at 2 a.m. Now I want to end this episode with a different question. If they died tomorrow, could you live with how you love them today? The drug supply is going to keep changing. Policies are going to keep being debated. Experts are going to keep disagreeing about what works. Meth supporters and 12-step programs are going to continue to feud. It's inevitable. But for you, you are someone who loves someone that is trapped in something terrifying. And what you do with that love, how you choose to show up, even if it's just a text that says, I love you, because safety matters. What you can live with at the end of the day, that is your decision. What you can live with versus what I can live with are not going to be the same. And that is okay. Even though the supply is going to keep shifting, your values don't have to. So if this episode helped you see something more clearly, if you think there's a family or loved one who potentially could benefit from it, please share it with them. Because simply sharing information isn't enabling. It took me having that seed planted multiple times when it finally started to stick. People are used to a lot of times one way, one view, because it's dominated, our country and the treatment industry for so long. As long as it helps you sleep at night, I support it. All right, you guys, thank you again. I appreciate you. And until next time, take care.